Hello and welcome to the Primary PE Huddle Podcast, brought to you by Aspire Sports. I'm Dan Hayes and I'll be leading you through this podcast. Aspire Sports is a passionate family who all believe that PE, sport and physical activity are essential for children to develop a love of healthy living and to end physical inactivity forever. We've proven that working in collaboration with school leadership teams, PE subject leaders, teachers and all PE practitioners positively impacts the sustainability of schools embedding a powerful physical curriculum and essentially helps more children be more active more often. Through this podcast series, we aim to discover the power behind PE school sport and physical activity in primary schools, the impact this has on the whole school, the impact it has on pupils' holistic development, and the secrets behind the successful implementation of a powerful physical curriculum. This is what makes up the Primary PE Huddle. We won't be alone through this journey. We're joined by PE subject leaders, school and academy senior leadership teams, and experts in the field of primary education, who all share what physical activity means to them, how they use it as a tool to positively impact children and young people, and what they believe in the Primary PE Huddle. Our guests perform a deep dive on topics such as creating sustainable, high-quality PE, the benefits of physical activity, a top-down collaboration to embed a physically active ethos, and sharing of best practice from their own experiences to create an enthusiastic culture towards a healthy and active lifestyle. If you like what you hear, please leave us a review and subscribe wherever you get your pods. So today I've got a couple of people joining me. I've got Andrew Stanton, who is one of my colleagues, and Andy Daly Mmith. I'll let them do their own introductions because I just won't do it justice, as I never do. So on that note, Andrew, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, a brief introduction to myself. I'm Head of Education at Aspire Active Education Group. So I lead on the development of all of our programs, including our physically active learning programs, so Maths on the Move, and we're currently putting together an English equivalent, English on the Move. Prior to this, I was a primary school teacher, and I was responsible for PE, school sport, and physical activity across the school. And that's where I first saw firsthand the impact that physical activity can have on the children that I teach. So I've always been a big advocate of creating opportunities for children to be active. And that's why I've been really looking forward to this episode, because we're speaking to our guest today, Dr Andy Daly Mmith, who brings such a wealth of experience and knowledge in childhood physical activity, both from a research perspective as well as an expert understanding in creating active schools. And I'm sure we'll cover the Creating Active Schools framework during this episode. But for now, welcome to the podcast, Andy. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for the introduction, Andrew and Dan. And I'm looking forward to talking about school-based physical activity and physical active learning.
Fantastic. So, Andy, you're currently a reader in physical activity and healthy childhood at the University of Bradford. Could we start off with just explain to us and the listeners what that actually is and what the role of a reader at a university entails?
Yes, it's a typical academic fancy title, but basically what it means is I just engage in research. So my job is to be a research leader at the University of Bradford. I also work at the Wilson Centre for Applied Educational Research, where I'm the co-director, where physical activity is one of our key themes around reducing social inequality for children and young people. And my final title is Associate Professor for Physical Active Learning at HVL in Norway.
Wow.
I know, that's a list longer than my own name. It's quite scary.
Impressive credentials, and it gets a bit lengthy on letters, I'm sure. So getting into where you are now and moving a bit before that, actually, can you tell us a bit more about how you got to that point, your professional journey? And along that journey, was there a key moment which led to your specific interest in physical activity?
Yeah, I'll shorten it because it could be the whole podcast. But when I graduated from university, I ended up working on a residential weight loss camp for children and young people. And that's where I sort of furthered my interest with children and young people, physical activity, health and well-being. Fast forward kind of 7 or 8 years, and I was lecturing at Leeds Beckett University and looking at doing a PhD. And it was actually at a conference in America where it was the last session being run by 3 policymakers. And the last question of the last session was, what would you recommend that we do as researchers to try and integrate more physical activity within schools? And all three of them said you need to demonstrate the link between physical activity, cognition, and academic performance. So that really was the start of my journey, or more formalised journey that began in 2012. So since then, I undertook a PhD and focused that around physically active learning. And then alongside that PhD, and since that PhD, I've done lots of work around school-based physical activity, predominantly around physically active learning, and looking at multi-stakeholder input into that. So listening to the views of teachers, researchers, policymakers, to understand what they think are the important components for a physically active learning teacher training program and how we embed that across a whole school infrastructure. But then more recently is broadening beyond physically active learning to look at how do we create organisational change for physical activity within schools and move beyond these kind of individual interventions that schools seem to have lots of appetite for, but they only tend to last for a short period of time before they move on to the next thing. And it's made physical activity very fragile in the past and not sustained, because when the next thing comes along or there's a greater need to focus on educational performance, physical activity often gets dropped. So it's how do we integrate these things into the kind of culture and ethos of a school so they don't get dropped when more important things come along. And actually, they are one of the most important things.
Yeah, I think it's that culture and ethos which sometimes, and just working on the ground with schools, we find that every school has at least one person, if not a couple of people, that really want to integrate that but struggle. They come across common barriers, and you see where it succeeds. It's we talk about this with other episodes in this podcast series, where some people think it's a top-down approach, some people think it's a bottom-up approach of how we actually start to embed this ethos across all schools in the country. And you mentioned about speaking to multiple different stakeholders in your past experience. Do you find that there is a big differentiation in viewpoints based on people's roles and within education?
Definitely. And I think the greatest example of this was when we were designing the Creating Active Schools framework, we used something called the UK Design Council Double Diamond approach. And we moved the stakeholders between what we called same stakeholder grouping. So that was where all the teachers were together, all the head teachers were together, policymakers, public health, etc. And we moved them into mixed stakeholder groupings where there was one of each stakeholder. And what we saw was within the same stakeholder groupings, the same learning emerged that you would expect to emerge from that particular group. So the teachers weren't really discussing anything novel that we weren't already aware of. But actually, when we put them into the mixed stakeholder groupings, we saw, because they were bouncing ideas and conversations off each other, that new learning started to emerge. And for me, that's where we need to start to move now with school-based physical activity, is to incorporate the viewpoints and understanding from these different perspectives. Just to go back to what you said earlier around, is it a bottom-up or a top-down? It's both. You know, it is fundamentally a whole school approach, and there are multiple factors that we need to address, whether it's a whole school approach to physical activity or whether we're talking about physically active learning specifically. We need to make sure we're addressing all those different factors at each level of the school system. So whether it's the children that we're working with, whether it's the teachers that we're training to embrace physically active learning, whether it's the wider staff, so we're creating positive social environments that those teachers can operate within, or it's the senior leadership team or the governors. Each particular stakeholder plays a role within that school environment.
Yeah, speaking about that, the top-down approach, I think I saw an example of this in the start of lockdown last year, where a lot of parents were becoming more immersed in what they were doing with the schooling, and some of the work that they were doing, their children's year 5 or year 6 work in grammar, left parents feeling, why are they learning this? What's the relevance of this? But sometimes those questions were directed at the teachers themselves, when really they've got this curriculum they have to deliver and they can't deviate too much from there. So it poses the question, does it really have to start with something, a big change at the top, where then the teachers they have the freedom to deliver in a certain manner when they're in their schools on the ground teaching to the children?
Yeah, I think with a curriculum, the curriculum dictates what needs to be learned fundamentally, but it doesn't dictate how that's learned. So they're two different things. And I think with physical activity, we're more in the how rather than the what. So, children, the obesity plan states children need to do 30 minutes worth of physical activity a day, and that school should be offering that to all children. But it doesn't necessarily dictate how that's done. So for me, that's where it's probably slightly different. That when we're talking about physical activity, there is some top-down pressure from the government, which is, I think, a positive thing. And then when you get to this kind of head teacher or senior leadership team level, that top-down pressure can only go so far. While a head teacher in a primary school especially has a significant amount of influence, if you have teachers who are resistant to that change, it can become extremely difficult. And we've worked with some schools who've had those experiences of a very positive head who wants to create cultural change of physical activity in a school, but resistance at a lower level. And we've also seen that the other way around, which is fundamentally why you need both. I think what's coming out of some of our most recent research is we need active engagement. So there's lots of kind of head teachers or senior leadership teams that passively sign up to things and then leave it to their subject leads, for example, to get on with it, or particular teachers. But unless they actively engage and show real interest, the programs still tend to fall over. And that doesn't mean they need to lead it themselves, but actually so your grammar example, going to visit lessons to see how they're delivered, showing the teachers that they're interested in what's taking place, tends to have a much more positive influence than those head teachers who are a little bit more passive in their leadership style.
Fantastic. I read a piece by yourself on the implementation of physically active learning a while ago, and it discussed some teachers' perceptions of physically active learning, and also discussed some barriers which stop physically active learning occurring. What would you say the main barriers are that stop it from taking place?
We got all day. We're actually just writing a paper, so I can give you some novel insights. We've done something called a meta-synthesis, which is a review of all the qualitative research around teacher implementation. And actually, I think there's two things that underpin whether teachers take physically active learning on. One is whether it's meaningful to them. So do they see that physically active learning is part of their job? And what I mean by that is, does it align with their values as a teacher and their beliefs around what they have as a teacher? And if they don't, and we can't sell physically active learning in a powerful enough way, they're not going to say what we call adopt physically active learning. They're not going to show an initial interest in it. The second thing is what we call a belief in their own capability to deliver it. So there's lots of work that we need to do around building up a teacher's belief in themselves. And the way we need to do that, or way the research evidence suggests, which comes from the mouths of teachers, is that we need to introduce physically active learning slowly. So we shouldn't be expecting somebody to do embodied learning, delivering physically active learning, integrating movement in the playground to understand the solar system. That is not your first lesson. Your first lesson might be a simple activity where you're doing number relays to learn times tables, as an example, or using tag to answer questions. And if you get those questions wrong, to then stand on the spot while someone comes and reads you a question, an addition question, you answer that, you get it right, and then off you go again. So what that does is it reduces the chance of failure. And we know, ironically, we talk about growth mindset in pupils. We know that teachers need to develop a growth mindset. They need to be resilient. They need to understand that things don't always go right in the classroom, and schools and head teachers and senior leadership need to create a really safe culture that allows teachers to trial and fail with a small f. Obviously, we don't want major failings because that can have ramifications down the line. But if your odd lesson goes wrong, it doesn't matter, as long as you learn from that and change for next time. And probably one of the biggest things that underpins this, if we talk about specific barriers, it all comes down to behavior management. So once you've built that belief in their capability, that they actually have the skills, and let's be honest, many teachers are already delivering physical active learning. They just don't call it that. So when we come along with this new term, they go, "Oh, that sounds really scary." Well, if you ask them, do your children move around the classroom? Do you take them out into the playground occasionally, and do your numeracy work with chalk on the playground? That's physically active learning. So actually, we showcase they've already got the skills. But once we're kind of there, the next bit, the major bit for me, is the behaviour management, and it links. It links to the research literature where it talks about those teachers who are confident in delivering physical education have no issues with delivering physically active learning, because it's a very similar skill set, managing a group beyond the classroom typically, but also managing movement within the classroom. So if we can, there's almost a need to enhance the quality of physical education teacher training and or physically active learning. And I think the two actually would work quite closely together.
On that link, I was going to say, because when you were mentioning about the behaviour management side of things, from past steps within my career in supporting teachers on the ground with their ongoing CPD and mentoring, it's the biggest surprise that I would see from teachers, and it's something I knew, whether they're an NQT, whether they've been in for a couple of years or 30 years, some of the teachers I worked with, was actually what you do in physical education is no different. The principles are no different to the classroom. And when you make that click and that link, it clicks with them. And it is that approach of the behaviour management was a big thing, because they're not in their classroom in their space where they know every inch of that room, and so do the children. They're in a different environment. It can sometimes throw things out and make them forget, from my experience, make them forget how good they are at what they do. But as soon as you make that link, it's really positive. You mentioned there about the research. You mentioned yourself and everything that's going on in Scandinavia with physical active learning. In the UK, it's definitely growing momentum, and over in the US as well. And there's key points to take away from that research. So, for a quick takeaway and a quick yes/no question, I suppose, would you encourage teachers to read that research? And what do you think are the key things schools can learn and teachers individually can learn from that research?
I'd actually flip it around, and I think this is where the research field is very, very guilty. We write peer-reviewed publications, and let's be honest, unless you're paid to do it, how many people are going to sit down and read a journal article? So I think researchers need to be better at communicating their findings to the practice field and sharing those findings with the practice field in easy to digest materials. The challenge with that is that we must not lose the sight of the way that data was collected, because that has a major bearing on what the outcomes can be. So I think it's important when we do digest the material, we present the method and the understanding of how the data was collected, because that shows the rigor behind the quality of the data. But then it's up to people like me to say, right, okay, how can we change these kind of peer-reviewed articles into short bite-size, whether they're written, captured in audio or short video, that can be easily digested. We know now that anything beyond 10 minutes really doesn't really capture the interest, because people switch off. So actually, why can't we as academics record a short 10-minute presentation or podcast, sharing those results and share that more widely? And I have to say, I do the same. If I think about my own personal experience, I love reading and learning around organizational change, leadership, those kind of things. But I don't sit down and read academic papers on them. I tend to read books and I listen to podcasts. So I think it's about us adapting our messages to new mediums.
So it's all on you then, Andy. It's all on you, is it?
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely. Because teachers are very, very busy. I'm a researcher who is 100% on the side of teachers. I will protect them to the end of the earth, because I think they have one of the most difficult jobs, as parents now realise, having been through the pandemic. So I think it's our job to make their role and job easier. In terms of the major takeaways, having said all of that, I think the two key takeaways, and I was writing an introduction to a paper this morning that probably helps me to articulate this, is what I call simplexity. We need to make it simple, but it's also really complex. So to onboard teachers, to get them to adopt PAL, we need to make it really easy to help them get started. However, to get teachers to use PAL in the way it needs to be used to get the benefits that are associated with PAL. And I'm not just talking about health benefits here. So moving up beyond health benefits, for me, it's looking at the academic achievement. Some of the results that we saw from the work we did with you guys around Maths on the Move, looking at the feedback that was coming from the pupils around teamwork, social interaction, those wraparound skills that actually, when we look at what 21st century employers want, literacy and numeracy is a given. But actually, those pupils or students or employees eventually who can show they can work as a team, they can communicate effectively, they've got good social skills, they are the pupils who are going to be employed for the knowledge creation jobs when they leave school and university. So for me, this kind of understanding of the complexity of what PAL is and what all the factors are that need to come in to help create that. And again, we could be here for an hour talking about that, but fundamentally it comes down to a teacher's ability to deliver PAL, the belief in themselves, making sure we provide enough resource to enable that to happen. And that resource can take shape of time to plan and deliver, understanding the environments that they deliver in and providing suitable environments, but also resources to help those teachers deliver. So, a very simple example that seems to come up again and again within the research literature is, at the moment, teachers or schools tend to buy into one particular physically active learning resource or kit. And the danger is, well, what happens if you're a 2-form entry school? So let's say you've got 12 classes that do physically active learning. That kit has to rotate around each one of those classes. Is it not better to put a more simplistic kit together that can sit in the cupboard in each individual classroom? So when the teacher is using PAL in a more autonomous way rather than sort of planned and prepared, and thinks, do you know what, the energy levels of my pupils are dropping, still need to cover some of this maths work. I'm going to take them out onto the ground. I can pull out the throwdown spots with the numbers on. We can do some simple numeracy or, number bonds to 10 with those throwdown spots. Everything's there. So I have to cite Professor Jim McKenna. He talks about fuel and friction. So we've got to think, how do we put fuel in the system to make things easier? And how do we reduce the friction? And that's a really good example for me of how we reduce the friction.
Brilliant. I think touching on something you mentioned there, like if there's a lull in the day and the teacher knows they have to still do this maths work, I think teachers intuitively know, without even seeing research sometimes, without seeing brain scans, they know that if it's, for example, been a rainy day and there are indoor breaks left, right and centre, that children need this opportunity to move around, prepare themselves to learn again in the classroom. So I think teachers know this. But going back to kind of initial teacher training and opportunities to get teachers in their early stages of their career to know and understand this, would it be that there's kind of snippets given to them? Is it that they're given little bits of information and then they're told, in your NQT year, it would be good to try a few lessons in a physically active manner? How would it work with you in terms of initial teacher training?
100% we need to embed this in initial teacher training. The challenge is how, and I think you've alluded to some of the issues there, Andrew, around is it a specific module? And the answer is there's probably not enough room in the curriculum to do that. So I would say it's probably a 2 or 3 session training workshop in initial teacher training that's then we expect to see that in the lessons that they deliver as an NQT, and when they're being observed, that they're the kind of things that are being looked for by the assessors. The challenge that we have is if we don't create those habits early on, we're then trying to undo those habits once the teachers are in practice. So almost we're not setting the teachers up to fail, but we're making it harder because they're learning to teach in one way that we then have to undo when they when they become a qualified teacher and almost retrain again. Having said that, there are some examples across the globe of universities who are now starting to embed physically active learning, whether it's in initial teacher training. And I know before I left Leeds Beckett University, and this was one of the, sort of the decisions that made it hard for me to leave, is we set up an undergraduate module on physically active learning, and many of those students would go on to initial teacher training pathways. So we're kind of embedding those behaviours early. And I think that the last sort of bit of the complexity of the piece of puzzle really is also when we're training those trainee teachers, and they go into the school environments and they're being mentored by teachers who are in those schools, what's the attitude of those teachers towards physically active learning? Because quite quickly, that practice can get hammered out by the teacher who's already in practice, who says, no, we don't deliver like that here. No, you need to deliver with your children sat down in a classroom. So it's about creating that whole ecosystem that's going to support the delivery of PAL.
Fantastic. I mean, this is really a lot of new information for myself, because Andy, I know you've worked with Andrew again on the study, and I was saying to Andrew before the podcast, actually, I'm going to be sat there as a listener picking up on loads of new things myself, which is brilliant. And just while you were saying it there, the question sprung to my mind of, is this something that can be filtered through? Is this something that physically active learning being embedded in schools across the country, is it something that can be done in 3 to 5 years? Or is it something that is a long-term goal that may take a decade, with teachers filing through that, all of this ethos and principle coming through the teacher training universities, those universities you said where readers such as yourself have got these studies, and actually the easiest way for that to be implemented is those universities doing these studies, like you did at Leeds Beckett, embed it into their teacher training, and then that ethos is built through the new generations, shall we say? But as you've mentioned, we may have teachers that have been in the job 30, 40 years that are for it. We may have those that have been in 30, 40 years that are against it. So I suppose it's some people may be thinking this is great, but there's so much going on, we can't just throw it in. We can't just throw it in. It's not going to work. Like you said, it's not going to have the legs to keep going. What are your thoughts? How do you see this panning out? Do you think it's something that could be done in the space of a couple of years, 5 years, a decade? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, that's another good question, and it's not an easy answer. I would say to fully embed physically active learning across the entire education system you're looking at probably 20 to 30 years. But that doesn't mean in the next 3 to 5 years that we can't make significant gains and start to change teacher behaviour. And I think there's a few ways to do that. So there's like the Maths on the Move programme that Aspire deliver, which is around external experts going in and delivering with schools and maybe training teachers up alongside that, so that you can bring some of this external expertise in, especially where I think what physical active learning is showing that it can be used with your pupils who maybe are not achieving their potential through traditional learning means, and actually use some of that pupil premium spend to bring in some of that additional resource, or use some of the PE School Sport premium money, because actually you've got a double benefit there of hitting a physical activity goal, but also contributing to your educational outcomes. And actually, what better way of spending this, COVID education recovery fund to have your pupils out in the playground learning rather than sat in a classroom and gaining more sedentary time? So I think there are things we can do in the short term. That one of the ways we're trying to support it is through a European project that was funded by Erasmus Plus called Activate. We are the work that I talked about earlier is underpins a European physically active learning teacher training curriculum that will be launched in September, and that will be free to access for anybody, because what we want to do is we want organisations, whether they're private training providers, higher education establishments, to use that curriculum to direct the development of their training programs. We're also developing free to access web-based resources or web-based CPD that can sit behind the more formal face-to-face programs, because there's a lot that needs to be developed, like I said earlier, to create successful teachers for physically active learning. And if we can do some of that with some online material, it then leaves that face-to-face time for more direct support to the teachers. So I know I've kind of partially answered your question. I think the short answer is it's complex. We can make quick wins in the next 3 to 5 years, but it is a long journey about shifting the culture of schools.
Yeah, I know Andrew's itching to jump on a question, but before I think, because he's jotting down loads of questions on this, and it's what I'm doing in my head as well. But just really quickly before I forget, for our listeners, would you be able to share after this podcast, and we can share it separately? Would you be able to share information on where we can find that information? Is that okay? And we can share it with the podcast on where they can access that.
Yes. Yeah, so it will be on activatingyourclass.eu, and I can send you through the web links, but the curriculum will be released in September. So basically it's just keeping an eye on that website, and I can also send the links through to that when it's released.
Brilliant. Yeah, I've got a couple of questions to get the opinion of a researcher, really, because I've always been fascinated about the impact that physical activity can have on, obviously, physical and mental health, but then academic performance. And you talked earlier about other things like, it might increase the confidence or give children a chance to work together, collaboration. There's loads of other things. This podcast is going to be listened to by a lot of primary-aged teachers who are teaching primary children. And one bit of research that I saw showed that children from the age of 7, they decrease year by year in the amount of physical activity that they do. Why do you think the main reason is that happens? Is it purely the classroom setup or the other factors at play?
Wow, again, another good question. I keep repeating this, don't I? Yeah, it's interesting. We used to think it was around the age of 12, and the more recent data is showing it's actually as early as 7. I think it's multiple factors that influence that physical activity decrease. To me, some of the headlines are, I think, the arrival of more sedentary learning. So this kind of progression from play-based learning in sort of reception and still hanging on into year 1, and this shift towards more kind of didactic, sat down, looking at the teacher at the front type learning does play a role. One of the papers that I've just written recently shows that the most inactive period in a child's day is during their maths and English lessons. And that, that has to have a significant influence on that overall MVPA. But also there's some really interesting work by academics in the sort of field of fundamental movement skills. And they say there's this window where a child's perception doesn't equal their reality. And actually you have this window, which is an opportunity when a child doesn't know how good they are, or obviously vice versa to that. You can develop their fundamental movement skills, but there becomes a point in time where reality and perception are one and the same. And they say that window is around 7 to 8, where a child starts to realise whether they're good or not so good at something. And I've probably recognised this in my own children, where I've got 2 kids. I've got one who is highly competent. I love watching him just move. He's agile, he's fast, he uses his body really well. And his confidence, is fantastic to engage in things that are physical. My other child is less so. And when he got to that age of 7 or 8, was making statements around, I don't want to do that, Daddy, because I know I'm not that good at that. So what that then does is naturally he then starts to draw back from the traditional opportunities for physical activity, which tend to be sports-based. And as a parent and as an academic who invests in physical activity, even I'm then racking my brain thinking, well, how the heck do I get him to be physically active? And we've gone out and sought climbing, riding bikes, swimming. But all of those things come with expense, and we're very fortunate that we can afford to pay for those things for our children to do. But for families who are less fortunate and don't have those financial resources, that's a real challenge. And I think, that to me, there's a number of things that kind of come together, but I think those two especially are probably the 2 biggest influences that I've seen. But I think that is going to be a a real sort of area for future research to start to understand what is behind this drop off around the age of 7 and 8.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, the most entry points are when they're doing maths and English, which is something that, again, like Andrew said, teachers won't have to read papers and see graphs and diagrams to be aware of that. They're aware of it already. But I think that's where, especially at that age, the amount of time they're spending in school, that's where the responsibility can come back and actually fall onto school time, and the importance actually then of not just physically active learning, but general physical activity, like you said, not just sport. Looking at physical activity, and there's those contributing factors. So I suppose, if you were to just give your thoughts or advice to the teachers listening, to the schools listening, there'll be external coaches that work in schools as well throughout the day and have multiple roles. What do you think are the key ingredients to achieving that goal of whole school engagement in physical activity? And I suppose, how do we make sure that everyone understands the importance of physical activity, whatever shape and form that takes?
So I think let's stop using the word physical activity and call it movement. Movement is really easy to understand. So if we work with schools and just say your children need to move, that's quite an easy thing to shift. Movement can be anything, literally from stood up to vigorous exercise. When we use the word physical activity, unfortunately, it's been integrated very closely with exercise. So people think moderate to vigorous physical activity straight away. And now we know that is about health enhancing physical activity, and that's the level we need to be at. But I think for many schools, even just movement, walking is important. In terms of what's the best takeaways for schools, so if I was a teacher or a head teacher, my number one question is, where is physical activity in the school improvement plan? I would then be looking at the effective spend of the PE School Sport Premium, and I'll be making sure that is clearly documented, because that is a vast resource that is ring-fenced for movement, whether that's physical education, school sport, physical activity, and it's not always been used in the best way. However, where that is being used in a great way, we're seeing exceptional work from schools. For me, next, it's then the sort of appearing policy and vision statements for the school. Do you have a school rule about movement? And then I think that the next thing is creating the social and physical environments for movement. So what do your classrooms look like? What do your playgrounds look like? Do you have green spaces that you can use? How do you timetable your indoor active spaces? Do you prioritize those for physical education and movement-based learning, or are they being used for other things that could actually go into different spaces? And then the social environment is make it acceptable. So if a teacher decides to do some movement in their classroom and their children are a bit noisy, or they take the kids out into the playground, the other teachers accept that is happening and they support that teacher and they're inquisitive and they want to learn from them. There's not a corridor conversation going on behind their back saying, oh, God, did you see Andrew going out again today? They're so noisy, so distracting of my pupils. I wish you wouldn't do that. That is surefire way, the best way to stop anything happening in a school. Because you do not, very few teachers want to be seen as that rebel in the workplace who is, who's sort of doing things that everyone else disagrees with. And I think engage the kids as key stakeholders as well. How often as adults, and I see this with some of the interventions that go into schools where we think, oh, this is a great idea, and I'm not going to name any, but let's make our children run around the playground for 15 minutes because that's absolutely fantastic. That's one of the most dull experiences that you could possibly imagine. Yet we think it's a fantastic idea to make children run around a playground. The research literature for the last 30 years has been telling us children hate cross country. Why the heck would they like running around the outside of a concrete playground? It's not improve. Well, it might improve them socially if they're talking to somebody, but it's definitely not giving them a cognitive challenge. And I can't imagine it's building passion in maybe more than 10% who already enjoyed running anyway. So I think it's about placing those three things at the forefront of what you do. make physical activity and movement enjoyable, because we know as adults, if you don't enjoy something, you're not going to continue engaging in it. And children are more hedonistic than adults.
I'm certain that's the reason why some things are seen as fads and fizzle out in schools, and some things seem to last the test of time. Because if you've got something which the children buy into and it's well received by all the children that are doing it, it's going to be much easier to keep its place in the timetable. I just had another question, Andy, about research. And you mentioned all moving's important, and MVPA, so moderate to vigorous physical activities, where the health benefits come in. I've just got a question about the amount of time that children are active for. And I spoke to Jade Morris about this, and she put it nicely in the fact that physically active learning could be put on a continuum from children who stand up in the class to answer a question right the way through to where the movement's absolutely integral to the learning. They might be measuring something out. Is there a minimum amount of time that a child would need to be active for it to have an impact on them, either academically or from a health perspective, or is all movement good?
So all movement's good, and the more you do, the better it gets, is the underlying message. In terms of how much a child should do a day, it's 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity, which is quite a lot, especially in the winter months, when opportunities outside of school are greatly reduced. Underneath that, it becomes a little bit more complex. So if we're talking about what we call an acute effect, so an acute effect is I go and do one bout of physical activity. How long does that bout need to be to get some academic or cognitive benefit? Generally, the research literature still hasn't confirmed this, but there's a suggestion somewhere around 10 to 12 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity that's sustained. So not over a period of 45 minutes, but over a shorter period, hence why running programs are becoming quite popular. On the other side of that, if we're looking for more kind of chronic adaptations, which we are, we want to sustain physical activity over an extended period of time. If you can add 10 minutes to every day that a child is in school, that is a significant public health change. That's incredibly difficult to do. And that 10 minutes the evidence would show that would have benefits on their physical health. So it's likely to help with weight maintenance and potentially reduction, as long as everything else stays consistent. And that's where the complexity comes in. But also in terms of what we call chronic adaptations that would improve academic achievement and cognition as well. So those studies that kind of show adding somewhere between 30 and 75 minutes a week of MVPA into the school timetable can benefit children academically. And I think there's probably two mechanisms for that. There's one where there's kind of brain restructuring and rewiring, where you might be increasing the blood vessels, and they might be reaching other parts of the brain. So that's called angiogenesis. Or it actually might just be if you're integrating physical activity within your learning content, and that the children in the class are enjoying that more. If you put greater enjoyment together with the need to remember information, you are more likely to be able to recall that information when it's asked for in a test. So actually, if you're out in the playground, let's say you go into the woods and you measure the trees, or you're collecting leaves to write a story, your emotions will be higher, your reward will be higher, so you'll be remembering more what you do because it's a distinct memory. Whereas if you're just learning every day, sat in the class doing the same thing, that doesn't stand out from the day before. So I think there's multiple ways that being physically active or increasing movement can help. And then, I've shared some insights in sort of my opinions on what children need to do.
I completely agree with you there, Andy. I can actually still vividly remember, I must have been in about year 9 or year 10, and our physics teacher allowed us to do a tug of war to demonstrate what balanced and imbalanced forces were. And that had a resounding effect on me, and I've never forgotten that. But if we'd drawn a diagram in our books showing the way the arrows move when the forces are imbalanced, I might not have remembered it. So I think it can be massively powerful to create these meaningful learning experiences. But given how important physical activity is, and it's a slightly different note this, but I'm interested to hear your opinion on tracking physical activity. Do you think it's needed that we track physical activity in a primary school at the primary school age? And if we do, how would we go about doing it?
Wow. I think the number one lesson here is human beings are not very good at recalling what they've done. So to accurately track physical activity, if we're talking about minutes of physical activity, you have to measure it. You have to have monitors, an objective way to capture what's happened. Am I somebody who wants to go down the route of putting activity monitors on every child to track how active they are? Again, I think there's still a lot of learning that needs to take place there. I am aware of of used tools like Moki, which I think have got huge potential to help shift the physical activity behaviours of children and teachers within schools, and increase the physical activity levels of children and teachers. So if we are using that data to shift the behaviour 100%, and the challenge is getting tools that will give us feedback as quickly as possible, that's as accurate as it possibly can be, that they can then be used to shift the behaviour that needs to change. Do we want to put them on every child? I think intermittently, I don't see any issue with that, and especially if the outputs are combined into their learning as well. There was lots of work back in the early days around the use of pedometers and I did a piece of work with Redcar and Cleveland Borough Council where they had a pedometer project, and it was about incorporating the outcomes from the pedometer into the learning material for numeracy. And I think they're good examples of how we start to bring the two together. The challenge we've got is we need to be really careful that if we don't handle that correctly, we know that close monitoring of health behaviour can also end up in problems with that health behaviour. People become addicted and pay far too much attention to it and become overly obsessive. And a good example is around eating behaviours. So I wouldn't want the same thing to happen with physical activity in children and young people. Maybe we could measure it through the teachers. A teacher's understanding of, because we know if a teacher or a school provide more, the children will be more physically active. Not every child will receive the same dose, but so maybe we can assess it at that level, and keep that kind of more formalized assessment away from the kids, and or just do it infrequently.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, I think, because as I've got older, I'm really interested in wearable technology. Every time I actually won't go for a run now if I don't have a Garmin on, because I want to have all the data and stats at the end of it. But when I think about primary school age children, I'm conflicted because I wonder, is this a step too far? And do we need every detail of every movement they make in the school day, which some of the new equipment can do? Or would we be better logging it on an app like MyMove, which allows children to log what they've done and then say how they felt about it? And would that be enough? What are your thoughts on children logging how they felt about the physical activity? Is that important?
Yes, in one-off studies, in to give us kind of snapshots into what they do and don't like, and help to use that information to shape what we provide in the future. I just think in terms of the challenge of logging physical activity is, for example, if you do physically active learning with a class, are they going to record that as movement, or are they going to record it as learning? And that's the challenge. If you this purposeful physical activity and this physical activity by stealth, children get the majority of their movement and physical activity by stealth. They don't choose to play football on a break time to be physically active. They choose it because it gives them this, a sort of cognitive challenge, really. And social interaction. So for a child to be able to accurately record everything that they've done is really difficult. To understand how they feel about that, I think, is useful, because that, like I said earlier, it helps us to shape what the physical activity offering is. And that if we talk about the Creating Active Schools framework, that all that data can feed up into the stakeholder groups who are deciding what the school provision is going to be.
Yeah, and a few things you touched on there, and a key theme within that is what's most, what is most important, what's going to impact change moving forward. So the tracking data, as long as we use it to make sure we make that change, and as Andrew mentioned, making sure things aren't a fad, and it does make impactful change in the way that we operate in schools, out of schools, and our attitudes towards movement. And what a lot of schools, as you're well aware, have been battling with over the past 18 months to 2 years is obviously the big C, COVID. And a lot of schools at the moment, back with all the children in school, hopefully looking forward to more of a normal year, shall we say, from September, but hopefully some changes made. So as schools are now starting to look towards September, getting back into the rhythm of what's been happening, but also keeping one eye on the fact that children have been in lockdown, teachers as well, everyone involved in the education sector and other sectors had these really troubling times. What do you think are the most important aspects that schools need to get right at this moment in time to have the biggest impact or the most benefit for their pupils, or maybe some of the things they need to avoid doing? What kind of advice do you think teachers need at this moment to focus on and to avoid?
So controversially, let's not bring students back into classrooms, sit them down to learn, and let's not extend that classroom learning time, because actually what we'll achieve by that is probably hammering out any love of learning that a child has. So for me, what we should be focusing on is not, and this is where I've got grave concerns, is not just the academic outcomes of children, but their ability to interact with their peers, work with those peers as a team, that they're happy, healthy kids. So I think we should be focusing as much on the development of those skills and opportunities as we should around the development of academic outcomes. And I think there's a way we can achieve both. And I'm very biased, but I think physical active learning is the way to do that. And actually, in a world where we're worried about COVID transmission, where do you want to spend your time? Well, if you look at the government recommendations, everything is about being outside. So actually, is this an opportunity for a culture shift within the UK to prioritise outdoor learning? And each school has a PE School Sport Premium Fund. Go and buy waterproofs. Buy waterproofs and wellies that can be used at a class level. And actually, you could probably kit a whole school out with that and build some sheds to keep them in and everything. There you go. Then there's no barrier to outdoor learning, unless it's absolutely torrential rain or gale force winds. There is then no reason a child can't be outside learning. So I think for me, that's what we'd be recommending. And actually, some of the work that we're doing in Bradford on the Jump programme, that's exactly what the schools are asking for. We want to get better in physically active outdoor learning. We want to develop our skills so we can keep our pupils outside, to not all the time, obviously, but increase the amount of time they're outside the classroom.
Yeah, and I mean, thinking about my little boy, he's only in preschool at the moment, but the times he's most excited is when he's been outside, and they do forms of physical active learning, which is fantastic because, as you mentioned before, learning through play, and being heavily involved in sport and a physical activity and exercise enthusiast. I love to see the excitement on his face. But as Andrew mentioned, when it gets to about this age of 7, that seems to drop off. So it's a case of making sure that's instilled. But as you then mentioned, it's making sure teachers have the opportunity to instill it. They have the ethos, the social acceptance, as it were, to instill it. And we've asked you some questions through this podcast where you've taken a breath before you've answered, and we've probably challenged you. So I'm going to ask you one final one now to give some real good takeaways for our listeners, and then you can finish this podcast and go have a breather. But the final question, we always like to give our listeners some key takeaways. I mean, they've had some great ones already, but what would your top 3 tips be for those individuals and those teams who are influencing PE, school sport, physical activity, and I'll throw movement in there as well because I know you're keen on the word movement, to support them in embedding physically active learning in their primary school setting? Top three.
Top three, right. Number one, and this may sound extremely biased because it's the work that I'm pushing at the moment. Use the Creating Active Schools framework to understand how to create a whole school approach to physical activity and more specifically physically active learning. So if you're going to embed physical active learning in your school, it's looking at that framework and understanding what are the different parts you need to address that go up the school system. So what happens in the lesson? What are the skills does the teacher need? How do you create those positive environments? How do you bring the stakeholders on? And how do you try and get it embedded in policy? So that's your kind of bottom-up, top-down approach. When we go into physically active learning, I think my number one is don't be afraid to go and celebrate if you fail. If you have a go and you fail, brilliant, because it shows that you're pushing your boundaries, you're trying something new, and you're not afraid to move beyond that kind of comfort zone. As long as you learn from the mistakes. I've delivered some terrible sessions in schools. I have worked in schools previously. I'm not a qualified teacher, and I've never pretend to be, but I have worked with initial teacher trainers. I've worked with undergraduate students. I've had to deliver physical education lessons on the spot when students don't turn up, those kind of things. And I've done some terrible things that I look back and I go, oh, that was a major fail. But you don't do it next time. I'm actually, all the times you push the boat out and you tried something that's different and you succeed with it. Wow. They're the real special sessions for me. So I think have a go and don't be afraid if you fail. Finally is, I've probably got a few, but I'm going to go down to build a community of practice. So try not to do it on your own. Try to work with other teachers in your school, or if you can't find them in your school, try and find a network of teachers that will come together where you can share ideas, because that will keep you enthused. It will make sure that you sustain what you're doing, and it will help give you new ideas so you can share resources. And of all the professions out there, teachers are the least selfish profession in terms of giving away fantastic ideas. The amount of things that the amount of IP that teachers give away on Facebook, and sharing Facebook groups, what a fantastic lesson that maybe the private world should look at and learn from, in terms of, things are done for the betterment of the society, not the furthering from themselves as an individual.
Yeah, that rings true with when I support subject leaders with assessing what's going on, what they want to achieve, and how. I always ask them the question, what do you need? And 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100, they'll answer in the sense of, well, my colleagues could do with this. We need this for my, and it's again, no. I ask the question of what do you need? And it's just, I think it's the nature of teachers. They're always looking out for the pupils. They're always looking out for what's best for others, and have to challenge and say, no, if you're going to drive this in your school, you need help. You need something to start to drive it, and they find it difficult, which. On one hand is fantastic to see, because it's their it's their nature to help others, but at the other times it can sometimes be frustrating that they feel awkward asking for something for themselves to then drive for the people. So that definitely rings true. And I mean, regardless of those top 3 tips, which are fantastic, there's so many gems to take away from this podcast. So I mean, I just want to say thank you. Like I said, I'm on here partly as a listener as well, because I wasn't involved in the work yourself and Andrew were doing. So the amount I've picked up has been fantastic. So thank you so much for your time, Andy. It's been absolutely brilliant having you on.
Absolute pleasure, and I love chatting to you both. Thanks for the invite.
Not a problem at all, not a problem. And finally, for our listeners, we've talked about the study that we did with Andy and Jade and the team. To find out more information, there'll be links with this podcast for you to find out further information with regards to the findings from that study. So please have a look into it. Andrew, is there anything else you'd like to say?
No, just again, thanks for your time, Andy. It's been brilliant.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks again for everyone listening, and hope to see you on the next episode. Join us next time for the Primary PE Huddle Podcast. Remember to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode. You can connect with us on Twitter @Aspire Sports UK, and find out more about us and the family at www.aspire-sports.co.uk and www.aspire-ed.co.uk.